Hola, buenos días. Estoy muy feliz para estar aquí y quisiera dar mis gracias a la doctora Tellez Rojo y todas las personas del Element y Progress, los dos cortes. Yo he trabajado con ellos por casi 12, 13 años a este punto. Hoy día voy a dar mi presentación en inglés. Tengo vergüenza de mi español cuando quisiera hablar en una manera formal. Por esta razón voy a hablar en inglés, pero mis transferencias están en español y ojalá vaya a ayudar a ustedes a entender que quisiera compartir con ustedes hoy día. Soy una antropóloga. Y voy a hablar sobre I'm going to talk about this concept that Mara, Dr. Tellez Rojo, and another anthropologist and I have been developing for the last few years called Antroposómics. And what we're really interested in is thinking about human activity as part of the exposome. So here we go. Yes. Okay, so we've heard about Dr. Christopher Wilde, who came up with this concept of the exposome in 2005. And when he came up with this concept, he was very clear that we should be integrating as many different disciplines as we can in our understanding of the exposome. And he was very explicit that social scientists like anthropologists and sociologists should be part of exposome research. But unfortunately, most of the time, social scientists are not integrated in exposome research. It's very much folks who can do what is considered big data and gather all kinds of quantitative data to help us understand what these exposures mean and what their impact is on human health. So as a social scientist, I think that's unfortunate. And the work that I've been doing in collaboration with the Element and the Progress cohorts has shown me, and I think Mara and some of the other researchers that we're working with, that if we involve social scientists, we can get a much better understanding of the human environment dynamics and interactions that are very complex that go into shaping what people's exposures are. So when you look at graphs or different kinds of visual representations of the exposome, you often see something very noteworthy. So you already saw this image on the right that Mara shared with us. And then here's another typical example of what this visualization process looks like. And the thing that I would like you to notice here is that in these diagrams, all of the arrows are going into the human being. The people are sitting in or standing in a very passive, still way, and all the exposures are coming at them. So this is the kind of thing that anthropologists or social scientists think about, but we also think about how human beings are actually quite active. They do all kinds of things all the time. So what Mara and Anita, the other anthropologist, and I, and another team of people have been thinking about is how standard representations of the exposome get us to focus our attention on what we call the arrows in. All of the ways that human beings are the receptacles or the vessels that receive these exposures. And they don't pay as much attention to what human beings tend to do and how human beings are a very active part of making the environments that they live in. So we, in developing this concept of antroposomics, are thinking a lot about what would happen if we integrated a sense of the arrows back. What are the things that human beings are doing to shape their own exposome and the environment around them? So what antroposomics is an approach, it's a method, and it's also a set of tools for thinking about human-environment relationships as very dynamic, as constantly changing all the time, bidirectional, or maybe we should say multi-directional, and it's very context-specific. So we can't really assume that even people in the same city have the same kind of exposures that people in some other neighborhood have, not very far away. And this is somewhat what Dr. Wright was getting at when he was talking about the specificities of an exposure map and understanding people's exposure maps over time. So what we have developed is kind of a toolkit for understanding what human beings are doing, and we are calling this anthroposomics. So what anthroposomics does, and what we are developing through a whole bunch of case studies, is allow for the generation of hypotheses, new measures, and new interventions. And I'm going to probably talk more about things that lend themselves to interventions today. And it was really great to have Dr. Wright's talk at first, because I think in some ways what this approach, anthroposomics, is doing is allow us to, yes, potentially get more in the specifics and the omics and the big data and the weeds, but anthroposomics can help direct our attention to where we might do that. When we're doing genome-wide associations, or if we think about exposome-wide associations, actually spending time with very different groups of people can help direct us to where we might want to be gathering that information from. Because what anthroposomics is it's open-ended. You go and you find out what's there first before you decide you know what your hypothesis or your question is. So, like I said, we've been developing a toolkit, and right now we've developed kind of a toolkit of 5 different techniques, anthroposomics techniques. And I'm only going to talk about 2 of them today, but I'm going to tell you the name of all 5 in case it piques your interest and you want to hear more. So one of these tools is developed by a colleague of ours, Mike Anastario, who works with farm workers in El Salvador and in Mexico, and thinks about how kind of late in life or later in life kidney disease might be developed through exposure to different kinds of chemicals through the life course. And he's developed chemical life history methods for eliciting an understanding of the kinds of exposures that farm workers have been exposed to over the life course. Anita Hardin, our colleague, has developed a tool that she calls the head-to-toe grand tour, where you sit with someone and you ask them about every single bodily care product they use. And you also have a very in-depth conversation with them about why they're using those bodily care products, what they do, and why they make sense. Anita Hardin has also developed this process of sensorial mapping, where you work with people to move around throughout their day and have them identify for you the kinds of things that matter to them or what impacts them most. Then I'm going to talk about ethnographic observation, which is a very kind of broad and open-ended approach to understanding people within their environmental context. And I'm going to talk about the work I've done here in Mexico. And then I'm going to talk about this last tool, which we call household chemical assessments, which we've done some pilot work here on in Mexico City. And this summer with Dr. Tellez Rojo and Megan and Dr. Bob Wright, we're going to be doing a much more extensive data collection of this. So I'll be telling you about what we'll be doing this summer. And what we're doing is we're understanding people's environments, but we're having them show us how they manage their environments. And again, this is what we would call the arrow back. What are people doing to manage the world around them and to affect the world around them? Okay, so first I'm going to tell you about ethnographic observation, which is kind of what we would call the bread and butter of what cultural anthropologists do. So what ethnographic observation is, usually, it's a form of very long-term participant observation with groups of people, and it's very open-ended. You're not going in with a really specific question or deciding that you know this is the issue here. You're going in to find out about people's life worlds in its totality as much as you can absorb it. So it means that you spend lots of time with people. Here are 2 images of me doing fieldwork when I was much younger here in Mexico City. In the top one, I'm spending time with a woman that I've now spent time with for over 12 years as she's cooking dinner with her family and learning about what she's cooking, why and how, and also whatever is going on in her daily life. and I'm taking field notes. You can see I have my little notebook. And then in this lower one, I'm actually getting a gel manicure from a woman that I've also worked with for about 12 years now, and she is a beautician and aesthetician, and she's telling me about her everyday life, but we're also working with chemicals. Like, she's telling me about which kinds of nail polishes she likes, or different kinds of machines she uses to dry your nails. So what we do as anthropologists is we take a lot of field notes, and then we write them up in computers, and then we use what are called coding programs, but they're more like tagging programs to help us look for patterns in people, the vast array of people's everyday life that we can then use to do different kinds of statistical analysis and also develop survey questions. But we would only develop a survey after we know what's important in people's life worlds. And I've been doing this now for about 12 years with these cohorts in Mexico City. And the other thing that I would just reiterate is that this is not hypothesis-driven research. And when I've worked with different researchers from the different cohorts, including a biostatistician, when she learned about all of this data I was gathering, it felt pretty overwhelming. And also, often this kind of data can seem really overwhelming to people who are used to collecting numbers. But this biostatistician said, that's another form of big data. And it is. It's another form of big data, and you can have different tools for managing that kind of data. So specifically, what I've been doing here in Mexico City since 2013, really, is I've been doing intensive ethnographic work with 6 families from within the element cohort, but then also all their neighbors in 2 different neighborhoods where there's a high density of element and also progress participants. And I did the most intensive work in 2014-15. I lived for 6 months in one neighborhood and 6 months in another, and did whatever my neighbors and these families were doing. I followed them to work, to church. We ate together, cooked together, went shopping, and went to parties, of course. I've been to a lot of quince años in the last 10 years, as you can tell. And all of these families came from the element cohort. Now, just to tell you a little bit more about the element cohort, one of the original reasons for that cohort to come into being was trying to understand the levels of lead exposure kind of generally, but there was a knowledge that people, especially children, had high levels of lead exposure in Mexico in general, and to a degree, Mexico City in specific. So Element was interested in documenting levels of lead exposure in Mexico City, and found high concentrations of lead levels, or high lead levels in blood and bone among children, and as well as some of the mothers in these cohorts. So that meant when I showed up in 2014, most of the families I worked closely with had been educated for almost 25 years in some cases, that lead exposure was not something that was great for them, and that the main way that they were being exposed to lead was by eating off of and using trastes de barro, lead glazed ceramic dishes, for their cooking and serving food. So they were well aware of this. So I spent long periods of time with these families and learned that despite this education, many families were still actively using trastes de barro, lead glazed ceramic dishes. And these are what they look like, and everyone here knows what they are, I think. So they were doing this despite all of this health education not to do this. And I learned from spending long periods of time and being at meals with people that these dishes had intense significance to people and their families. And they had this sense that we've been using dishes like this for a long period of time, and the lead itself actually gives the dishes a kind of brilliance. They shine brighter, and they also change the flavor of food. They make beans más dulce. And that this is a really important part of why you would use these dishes. That said, the education that they had received from Element and the cohorts in general actually made some of them engage in what we would call harm reduction techniques. So some families I knew use the dishes now only a few times a year for large celebrations, like at Christmas or during Semana Santa, or El Quince de, El Grito. They would use it during then. And sometimes they would actually only use the foods with non-acidic foods. But they were very convinced that using the dishes was a really important thing to continue to do. And in fact, like here is the comment from one of the women that I've worked closely with, saying, look, our ancestors have used these dishes for a really long time, and they lived to 100 years of age. And we have so much pollution in the world. There's so much air pollution. There's so much pollution in the form of pesticides. Why is the study telling us we can't use these dishes? These dishes are really important to us. So to Mara and Anita and I, we think this is a really terrific way to think about the arrow back. And you can get it through ethnographic observation. So instead of going in with a questionnaire about people's environmental exposures or actually specifically asking them about their use of the dishes, I spent time with people to see how are they used and why do they matter and how do they matter over the long term. And I could see that in some ways, standard forms of health education didn't really work to change people in the way that folks in public health wish they would. And I was also able to see that when people were talking to me about the dishes, they were saying these dishes are important for our health, for our collective being together as a family, and that is a form of health. So people weren't prioritizing individual health as the most important thing that, that they would organize themselves around. This also showed us that some of the efforts to try to get potters to use different glazes that don't have lead might have a harder time being received well than had been initially thought. I mean, all kinds of campaigns like this are very complicated, but that people themselves might not be interested in dishes that don't have the lead glaze. And I was able to learn what people's own strategies are for harm reduction. So I'm going to move on to this second example of a form of anthroposomics where we can learn about people's own activities and the arrow back. So I'm going to tell you about a way that we're trying to understand more about the exposome of the interior home. And like I said, we call this household chemical assessments, and we've done a little bit of pilot work on this that I'll tell you about, and like I said, we're gonna be doing this in 60 progress households this summer. So we'll know a lot more, and I'll have more to say, hopefully at the end of the summer. So a key thing about these household chemical assessments is that they're different than what historical environmental health approaches to looking or understanding chemical exposure is. So what Dr. Horton just told you all about was, I would say, kind of a newer approach where you're looking at all these metals together. But kind of in the past, and still to some degree, when people want to know about exposures, they say, oh, here's the exposure we're interested in, lead, let's go find it. And I think the exposome as an approach in general is kind of much more expansive in trying to understand exposure, and we're following that. So we're going into households to try to understand what's there, what are actually people using and buying in terms of chemical products. So what we do when we go into these houses, and we go more than once, is we try to find where all people's chemical products are, their cleaning products, pesticides, any kind of car chemicals. We try to find out where they are in the house, people show us where they are, and then they bring out all the chemicals, and we go through each product one by one to understand where people bought it, why they like using that product, how much. And we also document all the ingredients on the list of those chemical products. That doesn't always work because sometimes people buy products de granel, they're bulk, so we don't have an ingredient list. So we do all of this, and we're going to do this in many, many households. And just from our initial pilot households, we already found some really kind of counterintuitive or surprising findings that might not be the thing that you would test for if you hadn't done this kind of open-ended research. So for instance, we found out that in a household that they had more economic resources, people bought what they thought of as softer, less harsh chemical products that smelled better, and they wouldn't use gloves to do cleaning. And these are mostly women that are doing the cleaning in the house. And then in the households that had less resources, they would buy fewer products. They would buy something like chloro and use it for everything. And they would think, this is a harsh product, so I better use gloves. So there's some really interesting things going on there about the kind of exposures people might have, and we could ask different kinds of questions if we know that. We also learned a lot about smell just in the few pilot projects. So one thing we found, which probably won't surprise any of you here, is that smell is associated with love and connection in households. And people would tell us that, of course, growing up and now when they were, women cleaning, you haven't shown love if you haven't used Fabuloso or Pignol. Like the smell of someone cleaning with these particular products makes you feel taken care of or like you've shown love to people. So there's all kinds of emotive connections with cleaning products. We also learned from a lot of people about the kind of bodily products they use and how people giving them gifts of scent. I think that's telling me something, but we're almost done. Okay, stop. So that smell, of course, has all this emotive capacity or a capacity to really affect our emotions in all kinds of ways. And, I'm coming from the United States where there's more and more kind of education that people shouldn't use air fresheners. And there's all of this education telling people, don't use air fresheners, close your windows, air fresheners are toxic, they're bad for your health. It doesn't seem like there's as much of that kind of education here in Mexico yet, but it might be coming. But we learned that people actively used air fresheners and had some really good reasons to use air fresheners. For one, they live near places that smell like sewage, and air fresheners help you not have to smell the sewage. There's also auto exhaust, and there's industrial fumes. And there's really good reasons to kind of use these air fresheners. And so their form of the aerobac, their activity, is that if they were told to close their window, they often closed their windows because the bad exposures and the bad smells were outside. And so they were using air fresheners to keep the inside smelling good. And so I think this helps us think about any possible kind of interventions where if we're going to do an intervention on people's exposure to air fresheners, we're going to have to think much more structurally about the kinds of pollution that people live near. Instead of saying, you individually need to fix this, we need to think at this, again, much more structural level. And just quickly, this is kind of an image of what our gathering of the ingredients list looked like. And we were able to work with this thing called the Metabolomics Workbench. And just in 2 visits, we were able to identify 435 ingredients in 2 households, and a whole bunch of them had not really been registered in this Metabolomics Workbench kind of toolkit yet. And so we were able to gather data that hadn't been registered through kind of standard questions and surveys. So doing something like a household chemical exposure can really allow us to ask new questions and form new hypotheses. Like, for instance, could we test the difference between air indoors and outdoors with windows closed and windows not closed, with air freshener, without freshener? Could we think about the difference between inhaling a lot of chloro versus inhaling air freshener? What actually is the impact of using gloves, and how might we want to think about chemical products in that way? And like we were able to show with this list, we were able to identify new substances and chemicals that hadn't really been on the horizon before. So we're just going to sum up here. What we're trying to do by developing this idea of anthroposomics is integrate these approaches into standard exposome research. We think it's really important to understand what human activity is doing for individuals, but also how it is shaping people's environments all around them. We also, we always need to say this, we think that funding agencies need to become more open to doing this more open-ended research and allow for research that is truly funding a multidisciplinary approach to how we understand what the exposome is. And then we think that doing this gets us to better hypotheses, that we can do this kind of open-ended research and then develop hypotheses for the kinds of things that we can test quantitatively. And then lastly, and perhaps maybe the most important thing, is we think that this is really a way to understand what might really work and what won't necessarily work when we design interventions to help prevent harmful exposures in people's lives. So I'm going to end there with thanks to the Element teams. Many of you are here today, the Progress teams, and a whole bunch of the other teams that I've been working with over the years that have completely shaped my thinking in developing the anthroposome and the anthroposomics. Thank you.